But first up, when the big names talk, they talk to me on Talk Radio. A very warm welcome to the one and only loud voice of reason, Piers Morgan. Hi, Piers.
Hey, Kevin. How you going? Congratulations on the new show.
Thank you, and thank you for being my very first guest. I couldn't ask for more.
Well, for those who don't know our background, you gave me my first proper break in Fleet Street.
Yeah, I know.
Nearly 30 years ago now, you took me onto the bizarre column on The Sun, and so in a way, you're responsible.
Yeah, I know. It's my fault that you are such a star. You'd have made it without me, mate. But I was there. I was there at the start of your meteoric career, and congratulations on it. And by the way, I think you're doing a great job on Good Morning Britain with Susanna.
Thank you.
Keeping the politicians' feet to the fire, because we can't just supine, like bend over and take everything they give us right now.
No.
I want to call this bit sort of lockdown diary, so we'll get onto the serious stuff in a minute. But I know you, Piers. This is not natural for you to be cooped up at home. How are you coping with these extraordinary circumstances? A kind of house arrest, really.
Well, I think that, I'm trying to be very phlegmatic about it and keep it in perspective. One of the best memes that I've seen do the rounds on social media was quite early on when somebody said, our grandparents had to go and fight in world wars. We're being asked to wash our hands and sit at home watching TV. And I think if you can keep it into proper perspective, the sacrifice we're all being asked to make to save lives relative to previous generations is actually relatively easy. It's not as easy for many people as it is for me. I'm very lucky. I'm aware that I live in a nice house, but, I'm not, for example, in my house with a nice big garden. I've got a tiny little green space. I'm sitting here on a day like today with 26-degree temperatures and would love to be going out and having a good time and, swimming in the pool and so on. But that's simply not an option. And I think for everyone listening, we've really got to make a decision individually for the collective good, which is that actually we just have to suck it up. And whatever circumstance you're in, we're all in the same boat here. We're all equally susceptible to this virus, and we're all equally culpable for our behaviour and responsibility.
Yeah, I totally agree. I've been stunned by the fact that Manchester Police have broken up 494 house parties in 4 days. It's unbelievable, isn't it? Listen, can we talk a little bit about the serious side of this situation? Now, you've been catching a lot of flack because you've had the temerity to criticise some of the government's preparation for this crisis, which was, I think, slightly, well, to say the least, slightly lacking. And we all know that when this coronavirus crisis is over, God willing, there will be the mother of all public inquiries into the things that went wrong, the things we did right. Can I ask you to concentrate on one element that I think may need a separate public inquiry, the Cheltenham Festival?
Yeah.
Now, 4 days, 80,000 people went to Cheltenham. On the day that I was off to see my team Fulham play Brentford on Friday night, suddenly it was called off, quite rightly. 70,000 people were at Cheltenham. That was confusing to me. It was confusing to sports fans everywhere. I know a friend of a friend went with a group of mates to Cheltenham. One of them caught coronavirus, went home, gave it to his old dad, who was 92, who died. And that must be just one story from Cheltenham. How historic a mistake do you think it was to hold the Cheltenham Festival?
Well, it's very easy for people to play, Monday morning quarterback on these kind of things. I can play real-time quarterback because people can go back and find the show that we did on Good Morning Britain on the day Cheltenham started, where I actually took to task our own correspondent down there, my co-presenter Charlotte Hawkins, who was covering it for ITV Racing, and I directly said, why is it going ahead? And we had quite a sort of lively discussion about it. And we had AP McCoy on, the champion jockey, and I asked him the same thing. I said, I cannot for the life of me, the World Health Organization had that week declared this a global pandemic. We could see what had happened in China. We could see what was happening in Italy. It made absolutely no sense to me whatsoever that the government would actively encourage 250,000 people to amass in very tight groups at the Cheltenham Festival. And at the same time, Liverpool played Atletico Madrid. Madrid at the time was in almost total lockdown. Atletico Madrid weren't allowed to play in their own stadium in Madrid at the time.
Yeah.
And yet all their fans, 3,000 of them, were allowed to come to England and go to Anfield and watch Atletico Madrid play Liverpool in front of 54,000 people. Then we had the Stereophonics playing 3 shows that week to another 50,000 people. So you had 350,000 people amassing in large groups in the space of a few days in this country, in direct contradiction to what almost every other country in the world was doing. And the death numbers that we're now seeing, which are getting towards the 1,000-a-day mark, just to remind people, they're not the number of deaths that have happened in the past 24 hours. Some of these go back 3-4 weeks. And in fact, most of the numbers that we're seeing in these daily figures now will relate to people who got infections in the week of the Cheltenham Festival. I know at least 3 other people who went to the Cheltenham Festival who got coronavirus in varying degrees of severity, one very seriously. One, and I'm not going to name him, but one big racing fan, when I went off on one on Good Morning Britain on that morning it started, texted me to say, please stop calling it a shutdown. What are you doing? I went, I'll see you in intensive care. I very nearly did see him in intensive care. He got it badly for 2 weeks. He was nearly hospitalized. And, I'm not blaming that person, but what I am blaming is the government for allowing it to go ahead. And when we come to the inquiries on this, bear in mind that right now the UK is already the 5th highest death toll in the world, nearly 3 times China's total death toll, and that's where it started. And we are heading, and I couldn't believe this stat until I read the detail, but it seems to be accurate. At the current trajectory, we may end up with 40% in the UK of all European deaths from coronavirus. If that is true, heads are going to have to roll right across the board here, because the government was taking advice from people, and that advice was clearly wrong.
Yeah, talking of the government, I mean, I don't want to play too much heroes and villains here, but while we all sit around going, "Oh, everybody's marvellous," there's no doubting the commitment of the government and the effort that ministers are putting in, and we're all pulling for Boris Johnson to get better. It's a tragedy that he's not here to steer us through this crisis, but there's no getting around the fact, and I admire you for having the guts to say it on TV and in public, that mistakes were made in January. Experts were coming in with their advice, usually from Imperial College. One guy from Imperial College told the government, don't worry, there'll only be 5,700 deaths. Another group from Imperial College said, well, if you just allow coronavirus to run its course without taking any measures against it, 500,000 people might die. So the government suddenly changed. They weren't prepared in terms of ventilators. They weren't prepared in terms of PPE, protective clothing for NHS staff. They basically did make mistakes in January, didn't they?
Well, not just mistakes. They made catastrophic errors of judgment. And there's no doubt that we were very complacent in the first 6 weeks of this, from the middle of January, when the World Health Organization first said this had the potential to be a global pandemic and put everyone on alert for that. And we could see that Wuhan in China was on lockdown. That's a city the size of London, was in total lockdown. That in itself should have raised alarm bells. It did with me. I went back over my tweets around that period from towards the end of January through early February, and I'm tweeting about it quite regularly, and all I'm getting from the public is stop scaremongering, it's just another flu. That was the general attitude, and I fear it was the attitude taken by our top experts. We followed, there's no doubt that we followed a policy of herd immunity. We know that Dominic Cummings was telling people, because Tim Shipman from the Sunday Times exposed all this, he was telling people in February that our policy was herd immunity, protect the economy, and if a few pensioners die, then so be it. That's the price that needs to be paid. That was a summation of his opinion, and he's appeared to be driving the government response to this, even though he's an unelected official. We then know that herd immunity, at the very last minute in the middle of March, was exposed as potentially catastrophic and would cost 500,000 lives. And we did a screeching U-turn and then moved to the more lockdown strategies of other countries. But even with the lockdown, Kevin, we still have our airports open. There are still people flying in every day from China, from Spain, from Italy, from New York, all these epicenters of coronavirus, they come into our airports and nobody even checks them. They don't even have their temperature checked. They just march into the country.
Yeah, what do you make of that? I mean, why are they allowing this?
Well, because it says to me we're obviously still following an unofficial policy now of herd immunity. We're allowing millions of non-essential workers to go to work. They're being encouraged, if you can't work from home, go to work. So all the public transport system is clogged up with builders and other non-essential workers who are all crammed in like sardines, not observing social distancing, and all infecting each other, including many health workers who desperately need public transport to get to work. None of this makes any sense unless the government strategy is tacit herd immunity. And that, we know, could be devastating. And we're seeing already in our death toll numbers and infection rates that we're having some of the worst in the world. So there are going to be very serious questions to answer about this at the end of all this. But what worries me more right now is, what are we doing right now to curb this? And this brings me to a hot bank holiday weekend. People, there'll be lots of people listening to this who'll be planning to ignore government advice, to meet up with their mates, to go and sunbathe and the rest of it. And you just have to talk to anybody working in an ICU unit, any London hospital, to try and understand the gravity of what is happening here and the scale of the people that are getting seriously ill and the age range from young people to old people. This is not just something that affects the elderly and infirm. And frankly, even if it was, every life matters. Yeah. And I just think our whole response has been complacent. It's been weak. Even now, we're not in lockdown. And the final point I make about this, you look at New Zealand, which closed its border completely, has not allowed any flights in now for quite a period of time. They've had, I think, 3 deaths from coronavirus and just over 1,000 cases.
Yeah. I want to point out, Piers, that you're doing what journalists should do. I think the way people criticise you, and to a much lesser extent people like me, because we are making legitimate criticisms of this government. That's what we do. We're journalists. We're not here to roll over in a supine way and just accept everything just because we're in a crisis. But just before you go, Piers, can you tell me, how much trouble do you think the United Kingdom is at the moment in this horrible crisis?
I think it's in a lot of trouble. And I think that the death toll numbers for next, we were told this would be peaking tomorrow, Easter Sunday. We're now being told the peak will be in 2 weeks. We're already at nearly 1,000 deaths a day. That number is going to clearly rise. And we're going to end up with the worst death toll in Europe and one of the worst after the United States in the world. And the United States made all the same mistakes that we did, because if you didn't take it seriously early enough, then you didn't plan for ventilators, you didn't plan for PPE, you didn't plan for anything properly or fast enough. And then you're playing catch-up, which is what we're doing. We're playing catch-up. We're sending our health workers into battle with their hands behind their back, not properly protected. I go out and I see people like the bin men, like the pharmacists, like the shop owners, and supermarket workers, to the mailmen and women. And I look at all these sectors in the support group behind the NHS, and they're not protected either. So I think that we are in a really bad place. And the role of journalists is to probe and challenge everything this government is doing and saying at every stage of this. And I'll give you an example as I leave of why that's important. You and I were on the Daily Mirror working together when the Iraq war happened. Yep. And we took a position of challenging the government intelligence on weapons of mass destruction. We didn't think that it met the criteria of evidence that justified war, and we thought that it was illegal for us to then go to war without a UN second resolution, and we were proven in the end completely right, but by then 1 million people had died in a senseless, illegal war that also caused huge ongoing issues with Islamist terrorism and so on. And the whole Middle East was completely dismantled and sent into carnage. We're seeing it in Syria and Yemen, other countries. And the Mirror was one of the very few papers that stood up and went, not in our name, this isn't right. And we kept challenging. Now, we lost that battle. And it's very, very important that on this battle, that journalists do their job properly and don't just get boxed into this. If you don't support the government, somehow you're unpatriotic.
Absolutely.
Actually, if you challenge the government, you're being patriotic.
Yep. Well, you and me, Piers, we've covered some massive stories together. Diana, 9/11, the Gulf War. I think this is the biggest story ever, and I thank you very much for coming on to the show to talk about it and give us your thoughts. That's the one and only Piers Morgan.